Welcome to the Getty Centre and a Happy New Year to you all, if it's not too late to say that. My name's Susan Macdonald and I'm the Head of Field Projects here at the Getty Conservation Institute, or the GCI as we call it. And I'm also overseeing the Conserving Modern Architecture initiative. Welcome back to all of our regular lecture goers, and especially warm welcome to all of those who haven't joined us before, and we hope this won't be the first time that you do so. So, for those of you that haven't heard this before, we launched the Conserving Modern Architecture initiative back in 2012 with the aim of advancing conservation practice internationally as it relates to modern heritage. And since that time, we've been working to develop our program, targeting it on the needs that have been identified by professionals in the field, and we've spent a lot of time going out and talking to people. And in response to some of the problems and the challenges that are facing us, we've created a program that involves a series of things, including the creation and dissemination of literature, scientific research to address some of the material problems, capacity building and training, and field projects. And so if you want to know a little bit more about what we've been up to since then, you can have a look on our website, and we've been trying to keep it quite up to date and post all the new things that we've been doing up there. We're really pleased tonight to kick off the Conserving Modern Architecture lecture series for 2015 by talking about one of our own two field projects that we have under the auspices of the CMAI, which is the Magical House and Studio of Ray and Charles Eames. We actually rarely present our own field projects to you here in LA, but of course we're very keen to present this one. We're also going to be presenting the work that we're undertaking on our second field project, which is the Salk Biological Institute, a bit later this year. These two field projects are a little bit unusual, although not completely, because they're both right here on our doorstep. Many of you may not be familiar with the field projects that we undertake here at the GCI, so I'm going to just take a couple of minutes to tell you a little bit about them. They all aim to meet our mission of advancing conservation practice internationally through the lens of a practical project that might address very specific research questions, practical challenges, or capacity building needs, or various other conservation challenges that might have international relevance and can be applied elsewhere. So just to give you a couple of examples, we're currently working on the development of seismic retrofit techniques for historic earthen buildings, and that's a project that's based in Peru. We're working on the conservation of Roman mosaics on the archaeological site of Bulareggia in Tunisia. And we're also working on a wall paintings project in Herculaneum in Italy. We're also continuing our long-term partnership with China's State Administration for Cultural Heritage, which involved the development and embedding of a philosophical approach for conservation in that country, which was then modelled at a site, the Magao Grotto's site. So all of our field projects include strong research, planning and educational objectives, and often include scientific research as well. So given the importance of conserving modern architecture to Los Angeles and the importance of the Eames House here in California and internationally, I don't think there's really any need for me to further elucidate why us being involved in this model field project here in Los Angeles makes absolute sense for us. The GCI's partnership with the Eames Foundation, in fact, came very early in the life of the CMAI. It came actually before we'd launched the initiative, and it found its way to us via Frank Escher, who, in discussion with Wim de Wit, who some of you might know as our former manager of the Research Institute's Architecture and Design Collection, was in discussing about some of the tricky technical questions that they were facing in the conservation of the house. And to cut a longer story short, it seemed that we could perhaps help in some way, and we should, and despite not yet having a team set up to do this work, the privilege of being engaged with such a seminal work of modern architecture was quickly recognised by us all, and so started a wonderful partnership. We're often asked how we select our field projects. We are, in fact, very strategic about what we hope to achieve to meet our organisational and the project aims, and how a specific project can help us do that, and that includes where it's located. Often we go out looking for a project that meets our specific goals, but sometimes there is an element of happenstance, and this is one of those happy moments. We had in fact already decided that we would look for a field project here in California, so the opportunity to partner with the Eames Foundation was just meant to be. So our aspirations for the project are many, but first and foremost, and very simply, it's to demonstrate how all those usual practices of conservation, of understanding a building, understanding its history, its materials, how they're deteriorating, assessing its heritage values, and developing strategies for the short, the medium, and the long-term conservation. How that normal process of conservation can be applied to a modern building in the same way that it might be for one that was much more ancient. So to address this, we're presently working with the Eames Foundation to develop a conservation management plan, which is an internationally recognised framework for organising all the information and research that informs our understanding of a place and its significance, why it's important, and then developing policies to safeguard that significance into the future. And at some point we will look forward to being able to present that work to you, but we're in the midst of that right now. Secondly, there are very particular technical challenges associated with conserving modern heritage that result from the choice and the use of its materials. And our work is attempting to address a number of those. Tonight, you're going to hear about some of the work that's been undertaken to date that goes towards this particular challenge as they pertain to the materials found at and used at the Eames House, many of which are typical of the era. Thirdly, there are also challenges associated with specific design attributes of the modern era and how to deal with the very specificity of use, for example, or how to manage the place in a way that meets modern standards or requirements. And in this case, the challenge is really how to create an appropriate internal environment for the house, its fabric, and its incredible collection of objects, given that there are some physical and material attributes of the house that really contribute to the heritage values that you don't want to do what you normally might do in a normal museum environment. We're also really hoping to develop long-term approaches to extend the life of the house through proactive and preventative maintenance programs, and being able to demonstrate the efficacy of such approaches when dealing with modern buildings. We're quite used to hearing about how to do that with older buildings. For modern buildings, it's like, let's chuck the materials out and replace them straight away. So how could that philosophy be applied here? So tonight you're going to hear about some of the work that's been undertaken towards these goals and that were needed in the short term to inform what has been described as the Phase 1 works to the house, which are the subject of tonight's event. The Phase 1 works describe the urgent works that were undertaken over the last 2 years that were catalysed by the removal of the contents of the living room for the fabulous 2011 LACMA exhibition, California Design 1930 to 1964, Living in a Modern Way, and I'm sure many of you had the opportunity to visit that. This opportunity also galvanised the Eames Foundation to establish a much more ambitious program, which Lucia Dewey Atwood will discuss in a minute, a program of really careful investigation, research and long-term planning that addressed the house, studio and landscape holistically in order to secure its future. So let's meet our speakers. Lucia Dewey Atwood will introduce the project and present the aspirations and intentions of the Eames Foundation, who are our partners and who are the incredibly careful steward of the Eames House. Lucia Dewey Atwood is the director of the Eames Foundation's 250-year project and the board member responsible for dealing with the preservation of the house. The Foundation's architect for Phase 1 works, Escher GuneWardena Architecture, represented by Principal Frank Escher, is our second speaker, and Frank is going to present the project work undertaken over the last 2 years at the site. Our third speaker will be Normandin, who's the former GCI project manager during this phase of works, and he's going to talk about what we were actually doing here. And Kyle is an associate principal at Janney Elstner and has had a long involvement in the preservation of 20th century heritage. And you all have programs tonight, and there's some more information about each of our speakers on the back of that particular program. So after all of our speakers, Lucia and I are then just going to wind up very quickly with some of the things that are happening right now and are happening next. And then we're going to have time for hopefully some questions from all of you and some discussions. So we're going to hold questions from the individual speakers until that particular time. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lucia Dewey Atwood.
On behalf of the Eames Foundation, I am delighted to be here with the Eames House Project team. So we see the house, of course. And then here you see Charles and Ray Eames in 1950. They took numerous photos of their house, which they compiled into a film that they called House After Living, after 5 years of living. The images show how the pair explored and saw their house, what they found to be beautiful, inspiring, and worth communicating. You will be seeing a free-flowing sample of the images from this film as well as others taken later in their lives as I talk about how we at the Foundation developed our conservation philosophy. These images provide a wealth of information, helping viewers to understand the Eames' intent, where rigor is carried through into the smallest of details, essential to joy on the largest scale. As Charles said, the details are not the details, they make the product. In the decade after Charles's death, Ray reflected on the many possibilities that were open to her to preserve the Eames house. When she died in 1988, she chose to protect the house by leaving it to her daughter and my mother, Lucia Eames. In 2004, Lucia put the house, land, and contents into a newly created foundation, the Charles and Ray Eames House Preservation Foundation, Inc., or simply the Eames Foundation. From the earliest days, even before the house was finished, people would come to visit the Eameses. Charles and Ray would graciously welcome them, and visitors tell of how they were invited in for a piece of cake and some coffee, or even a shot from the vodka that Eero Saarinen had gifted them. So it felt right to the family to continue this tradition of sharing the site with visitors. That visceral experience is key to not only to understanding any site, but also to learning from the site. Charles and Ray believed deeply in the value of direct experience and the ability of people to internalize knowledge. And our mother wanted to give that direct experience to others. The Eames House consists of two structures, a residence and a working studio carefully sited within the landscape. They are presented appropriately, which in perfect Eamesian fashion means differently. The studio had always been a flexible use space, changing function depending upon the Eames' need. It's been a working studio, a guest suite, a home office, and skunkworks. And then after Charles died, it was Ray's bedroom. Right now, it is the headquarters of the Eames Foundation, and it is furnished to meet our needs. So we have contemporary Eames furniture, along with objects from the Eames' work life. On the other hand, the residence is kept as it was during the Eames' lifetimes, filled with the stuff of living, books and rugs and art and furniture, whether it's designed by themselves or others, and certainly gifts from many of their dearly beloved friends. We chose to leave the house as it was as of 1988, the year of Ray's death. In fact, the presentation of the space has changed little from when Charles was also alive, and even from 1958, when the team moved their creative working life entirely down to 901 Washington Boulevard, the Eames office in Venice, California. This choice, though, to leave the residence as furnishings in situ was easy for the family. Why innovate? As Charles always said, innovate as a last resort. Why lose the bits and pieces of knowledge that are embedded in this presentation? The design is purposeful. It's both beautiful and warm. Objects, whether a pebble or an art piece, are set in relation to others, and then that group in relation to other groups, and then so on until the relation to the structure itself. It was a home filled with gifts from friends, families, and colleagues. The way the Eameses lived their life at home echoed how they lived it at work. They anticipated their guests' needs, whether welcoming visitors at the house with delightful treats or designing a cheer that considers how best to meet the needs of that user. I suppose the guest in this case. They believed in the iterative process that redesigning and rethinking and honing your ideas down to a project to make it the way it should be, whether when they were creating 3 versions of their film, The Powers of 10, or the 2 designs for the house. and certainly the constantly evolving furniture decor during their early years. Our goal is for the house to look as though the Eameses just stepped out. Not in a fetish-sizing sort of a way, but because it best captures their intent, which is intimately linked to how they use the space. Of course, elements such as bouquets will be different from when they were alive, but nonetheless, when Charles and Ray were home, they would throw open the curtains and open the doors and windows, and we do too. With doors open, the patios and the structures become a long, unified space for living. Tonight, our comments are focused on the structure and how it is impacted by its contents, but Charles said everything eventually connects, so the landscape must be mentioned. The final house design was driven by their desire to preserve the meadow and the row of eucalyptus trees. And the meadow moves between a green and a sere as the rain falls or not, depending on the season. And as one visitor said, the Eames House is the only place in LA where you can experience the seasons. This appreciation of nature is an essential part of life in the house. This seamless integration of structure with nature indeed provides a reorientor and a shock absorber, as Charles and Ray said in their 1945 issue of Arts and Architecture magazine. In order to continue to present the house as it was during Charles and Ray's lifetimes, we need to understand how it was cared for. When the house was first built, much of the original finishing work was done by the Eames office staff. And as time went on and repairs were needed, the staff continued to care for the house. And just as with their chairs, the Eameses would embrace ways to make the house work better. Now consider, the house was supposed to be welcoming, perhaps as Charles said about their lounge chair, with the warm, receptive look of a well-used first baseman's mitt. So when curtains were brought back from the dry cleaners, for example, they would be shaken out so that the folds would not be too crisp. After Ray's death, Lucia continued to follow the Eames' caretaking approach. Both Ray's housekeeper and gardener continued to care for the property, and repairs were, of course, done when necessary, such as when a roof leaked or pipes burst. But the goal was always to retain as much of the original material and way of doing things as possible, and to avoid work that would disrupt this fabric unless greater harm would be done by not fixing the issue. Eames Demetrius, my brother and the chairman of the Eames Foundation board, and his wife, Shelley Mills, guided the process, making sure that the house fabric was fully respected and that no quick holes would be drilled or some change would be made that would affect the look of the house. We were keenly aware that once the original fabric was lost, a small piece of authenticity would disappear, and perhaps a clue to a future key understanding. Nonetheless, there comes a point when following what has been done before is no longer sufficient, and a more drastic intervention is required. Now, that can sound like a failure, but it is a success. In this case, the house is still there awaiting a very thoughtful approach and intervention. So we worried, though, as a foundation, that as repairs accumulated, the authenticity of the site would disappear. And we needed that well-thought-out approach, especially for when a material's lifespan was exceeded and that material was no longer available, a problem we expect will grow as the years pass. These concerns led to the development of our 250-year project. The goal is to preserve the house so that our great-great-great-great-grandchildren will be able to come to the house and have the same experience that you and I will. There are conflicts between the needs of the house, its landscape, and its contents. Now, on an optimistic day, I would call them tensions, because that really does acknowledge the many shades of gray that exist. The trick is to find that gradation that best balances the conflicting needs. Just to name a few of those tensions, the opening of doors and windows to show the Eames' use of space versus closing them into a hermetically sealed box. Clearly not our choice, by the way. Having light illuminate the structure versus the impact on finishes and furnishings. There are also tensions between design philosophies and approaches, the authenticity versus the look. How do you maintain a comfortable, well-kept living space in the face of deteriorating materials? And the use of original materials and processes versus an improved technology that would extend the life of the whole. Or the use of off-the-shelf materials or custom order. As simple as it sounds, that conscious realization that we needed to take a long-term approach was one of those aha moments. It changes the entire approach to caretaking and requires addressing the short-term need within a larger context. We took guidance from Charles and Ray's 1958 India report, in which they discussed the process of designing a lota, a common vessel used for carrying liquids, whose design has evolved iteratively through generations. The report became our model. They said first one would have to shut out all preconceived ideas on the subject and then begin to consider factor after factor. So as the list of factors extended, they noted considering the texture in terms of cleaning and feeling. And how pleasant does the item feel or sound as it's struck? Or how does the sun look when it reflects off of it? All these considerations shaped our view for the new tile floor, and together they support that sense of way it should be-ness. The event that kicked off the start of the project was the acceleration of the cracking of the living room floor. For visitors, it was hard to see the room as an integrated whole. We knew we wanted to fix it, but we also knew we needed a plan for action, not only to address the floor, but also to really figure out how to preserve the contents while the work was being done. LACMA approached the Eames Foundation about borrowing the key elements of the living room for an upcoming exhibition on California design during Pacific Standard Time. Our board chair, Eames Demetrius, suggested they take it all. Yeah, in the hopes that they would take it all, we prepared and we spoke with different architects. And in January 2011, LACMA said they would take it and that they would need the objects to be transported in August. Now, this was the answer to our dreams. Not only would LACMA be storing the objects, essentially, but they would pack and ship them and do conservation work on fragile objects. Here we see the beautifully conserved Andin lamp. Even though we would have preferred to have a schedule of work identified in sequence before starting on the project, logically, we had to take this opportunity. Even if only the new living room floor was completed, we felt that the project would be a success. But we were able to accomplish much more while the living room's contents were at LACMA. With the strong support of our project team and very generous donors, the project expanded into addressing areas of active water intrusion, such as on the steel frame. Now, the delamination here looks alarming, but it was great to find out that that piece was a sacrificial piece and the structure itself was in remarkably good shape. And that underscored for us the power of really solid maintenance. The spine wall in the living room and patio were also conserved during this time, and as we chose, the traces of life were retained. Stains from when the planter was set against the wall, or darker areas where the sun did not hit. Here we see the results of the work. The haze is gone. You see the wood as well as the traces of the Eames's occupancy. And Frank and Kyle will go into the details of this specific work. Our goal is to leverage this work by sharing the results with the larger community. Hopefully the documents from our project will be tools that will help those asking the same kinds of questions to make the best possible choices for their own structures. The additional work was made possible only because of a community of passionate supporters. Funds for the work were raised by many generous individuals and corporate sponsors, with special thanks to our founding sponsors, Herman Miller, Vitra, and the Eames office. We had spoken with a number of amazing architects and selected Escher GuneWardena. They offered an artist's eye for a property filled with color and finishes, and they identified team members who brought us our amazing general contractor, Tom Montgomery, and other teams, with special thanks to Chris and to Rick from RAC and painter Brian Miller. This is the beauty of unanticipated consequences. The foundation had had a long history of hosting Getty scholars who visited the house, who deeply appreciated the site. And Frank and Ravi, as Susan said, spoke with Wim de Wit, who then suggested that we speak with Susan. So thank you, Susan. And thank you to the entire team here at the Getty Conservation Institute and the broader Getty team. It has provided input, guidance, and research, investigations that have elevated our project to the highest standard of excellence. And Kyle, your commitment and passion has been something I cherished. At one point, the words were actually formulated: restore the house like a piece of art. Was it the architects, the Getty? No matter. Clearly, these are the right partners. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would first like to thank the Getty Conservation Institute for organizing this event tonight, and I would also like to thank Lucia Dewey Atwood for her introduction. I also want to mention that I'm speaking on behalf of our firm, which includes GuneWardena and our project architect, Bojana Banyas. In the 60 years since its completion, the Eames House aged the same way that any other house would age. But it is important to remember that the Eames House was very carefully designed, it was very carefully built, very carefully lived in, and very carefully looked after. The conservation of the Eames House, in fact, began after Ray's death, as Lucia mentioned. To secure the house's survival, the Eames family set up the foundation that has maintained the house for the last few decades, often with great sacrifices of time and money. As a result, the 6-year-old house is in remarkable condition. I feel that we collectively owe the Eames family and foundation a great debt of gratitude. This is not the norm. The Eames Foundation's stated goal and directions for the project from the onset were to not erase traces of the house's history and to maintain historic fabric where possible, even when and where this was not in pristine condition. These parameters recognize that the history of a house reveals itself in faint traces, the odd chipped pane of glass, slight dents in metal edges, discoloring or stains on wood. These delicate traces create atmospheric conditions as important as technical matters. This also aligns with Ravi's and my own thinking. We were particularly fascinated by the pattern of cracks, the craquelure, on a painted metal surface. It was then, at a meeting early in the process, while examining the house and assembling a team of consultants, that we came to the conclusion that the house should be approached the way a conservator approaches a valuable painting. That is, when we turn to the Getty for recommendations for conservators. At the time, we were unaware of the impending launch of the Getty Conservation Institute's Conserving Modern Architecture initiative. The Eames House, as you know, became the first case study in this program. Restoration or conservation projects require a small army of specialists and consultants. The projects are less about the authorship of the conservation architect and more about collaborations of great complexity. Lucia mentioned some of the objectives and the time frame that we were presented with. I will focus here on the floor and before that on the window wall, and in particular on the southeast corner, which is up here. And you see a detail. In the first step, the structure, and more relevant here, the envelope, the two are completely meshed together, was examined. This analysis, conducted by Andrew Nasser, a structural engineer who actually worked with Saarinen and later with Lautner, showed that the structure itself was in excellent condition and that the steel structure and the envelope were more vulnerable to wind than to seismic loads. We next examined and mapped the different types of glass we have at the house and the studio. Glass that was original to the house and glass that was introduced at a later point. Historically, the types of glass included so-called double-strength glass, polished plate glass, textured glass, and wire glass, an interesting statement in itself on how the Eameses introduced different levels of transparency and translucency into their project. We also knew, though, that, for example, in the Northridge earthquake, in January of 1994, about 40 different panels of glass shattered and needed to be replaced. In the next step, we commissioned a condition report for the entire window system, a project carried out by RAC, a design-build company with much experience with mid-century restoration and with the capability to engineer and fabricate custom steel windows if necessary. All profiles and frames, as well as other components, such as the putty, were examined and the findings were mapped. This information from these two reports was then transferred into a main database of the house, a very precise 3D model, cataloging existing conditions that would need to be addressed. Overall, the frames have held up impressively well over the years, though the condition of windows varied greatly. Some of the worst windows were on the east facade and near the bottom of the house. Most mildly rusted windows could be stripped and repaired in place without necessarily removing the glass, which is glazed from the outside. None of the floor-level hopper windows opened anymore. In general, operability of windows was largely compromised for various reasons, including corrosion, layers of paint on the steel profiles. A tighter seal could probably be achieved, even without gaskets, by removing layers of paint on the steel. The overall condition of the windows, the difficulty to open or to close these properly to create a relatively sealed interior environment was an issue of great concern. This is a topic that Kyle will discuss. We see here details of this window wall, which also shows one of the house's idiosyncrasies. Units of fixed and operable windows, developed to be placed within conventional walls, were combined by the Eameses into a curtain wall of sorts by introducing various wooden vertical connection pieces. These are the wooden pieces here. The wood is visible on the inside, but is painted to match the surrounding frames. The section on the right shows some of the proposed interventions to seal these windows. The most severe damage was found at the sills at the very bottom of the hopper window. This is the piece that Lucia referred to as a sacrificial piece. These steel pieces, for the most part, had corroded to a point where they would need to be replaced. I should add here that in the first phase of the work, we only addressed issues that needed to be coordinated with the replacement of the floor, as well as dealing with general operability issues, awning and hopper windows, which could be restored so that they could be opened and closed. The work on the rest of the facade awaits various steps, including the final analysis of interior and exterior color and paint, which is also a topic that Kyle will address, as well as, importantly, the foundation needing to raise substantial funds for this project. To just walk you through this process, we see here the sills being removed, the sills being fabricated on site, the completed sills, and the new sills being installed. As opposed to the original sills, which were spot welded to the frame of the unit, the decision was made to mechanically fasten, which means to screw these new sills into place, allowing them to be easily removed should this become necessary in the future. Lastly, the new spring-mounted window stops, which slide within the vertical tracks and allow the window to be secured in various positions, are being welded into place here. We have 3 sliders, one at the living room, one at the kitchen, and a third slider at the studio. While all 3 sliders are made from similar components, each has its own peculiarities, reflecting their different physical and conceptual positions. The studio slider, for example, is divided into multiple panes of wire glass, continuing the building's rhythm, while the sliders at the house have single large pieces of clear glass. Further, while the living room slider is protected by the generous overhang at the terrace, the studio slider in particular is completely exposed to the elements. What they do have in common with each other, and indeed with the window system of the house, is again the combination of steel elements with wood. Meant here to provide stiffness to the elegantly thin frames. These frames, though, had warped over time, making the sliders difficult or even impossible to move. Additionally, the resulting gaps allowed infiltration of dirt and dust, water and air, rendering the house vulnerable to the exterior climate. The warping was remedied by inserting into the frame a secondary steel stiffener, which you see right here. The addition of weather strips and brushes, carefully placed to make them less noticeable, helped to further seal the sliders. So here again, some of the work. You see here the wood that is part of the sliders. All of this work again was done at the site, and this is the cavity that I mentioned where this steel stiffener was installed. Parts of the slider were simply refurbished. Here you see the rollers, while other parts received more drastic treatment, dealing with corrosion, replacing protective steel angle at the top of the door here at the studio, or replacing some of the wood elements here seen before they were painted to match the steel frame. The result was that the sliders that had not been operable for years, or some of them, can now be opened and closed with ease. The existing floor in the living room was installed approximately 2 years after the house was built. Early photographs show an exposed slab in the living room. The floor consisted of 9-inch by 9-inch white vinyl asbestos tiles, VAT, glued to the poured-in-place concrete slab. And while the manufacturer and specifications of the tile and adhesive are unknown, the product name vinyl asbestos tile hints at one of the problems. The asbestos content of the tile was confirmed by testing, while it was also determined that the adhesive itself was free of asbestos. The visible damage to the floor included sections of detached tile with broken corners, discoloration, crazing, open and irregular joints between tiles. This was generally consistent with the inherent tendency of vinyl to shrink and become brittle over time as the product's plasticizers outgas, a process that may have been accelerated in areas exposed to sunlight and heat through the windows. There was a brief discussion about possibly conserving the existing floor as an important document, so to speak, of the building's history. But there was a second critical issue: moisture penetrating through the concrete slab. This may also have been a factor in the deterioration of the tile, which would also be an issue for any future flooring, and more importantly, would potentially have a negative impact on the overall environmental condition for the house and the collection. In order to adequately study and address this moisture penetration, it would be necessary to remove the tiles in the living room and determine a suitable treatment before a new finish could be applied. Once the decision was made to remove and replace the existing floor, the discussion focused on researching a suitable moisture barrier, a system that would not impact the minimal clearances between the finished floor and the window frames, as well as possible replacement materials. In this process, about a dozen of possible products and manufacturers were researched, including natural rubber, which could be a close match in color and would be the most sustainable material with excellent durability and maintenance qualities, as was synthetic rubber, which would allow a better match of surface texture. The decision was made to replace the vinyl asbestos tile with a vinyl composite tile floor because this would be the closest match in texture, thickness, tactility, and sound to the existing floor. The discussion then focused on whether we should replace the existing floor with an off-the-shelf product, an approach which would have been more in keeping with the approach the Eameses originally took in building their house. You see here an advertisement of the time for a similar product. Again, we don't know at this point who the actual manufacturer was for the original tile, or if we should custom produce the replacement tile. The issue was the color. The original floor was actually not white, but a very pale gray. And the off-the-shelf products were all simply too white. You see here, this is an off-the-shelf material, and this is the tile that came close. That is the match to the existing floor, but it is a custom produced tile. We examined this issue by having several large sample areas, about 4 by 4 feet, installed at the house to compare the colors on site and to the other elements, in particular the wood wall. One has to remember that Ray Eames was a painter with an extraordinary sense of color and balance of colors. The decision therefore was made to have the floor custom fabricated. Floor tile is no longer made in 9-inch by 9-inch squares. Instead, it is typically made in 12 by 12 or 20 by 20 inch dimensions. Whatever replacement tile was selected would have to be cut to size. Cutting by water jet, die cutting, and CNC milling, which you see here at the very right, was examined to make sure that the seams between the tile were satisfactory. After removing the vinyl asbestos tile by a qualified abatement company and exposing the concrete slab and conducting the moisture measurements, installation began of the moisture barrier. A MAPE system consisting of a sealer, a primer, and leveler, basically a skim coat, was selected because it best addressed the various issues I pointed out. All of the products were tested at the Getty individually, as well as in combination with the adhesive, the replacement tile, and the sealer for off-gassing to ensure that no new product could potentially adversely affect the museum-level environmental conditions that the house ultimately should have. In preparation of the installation, the concrete floor was first shot blast, you see this on the left, and allowed to off-gas for about 24 hours. Next, the sealer was applied and left to cure for 24 hours, right? After the sealer had cured, one coat of undiluted primer was applied on the left, allowed to dry for about 4 hours, and then 2 coats of skim coat were installed, with around 60 minutes of drying time in between the skim coats. Following this, the tile was installed, carefully cutting around existing frames and outlets. The entire installation process was overseen by our general contractor, Tom Montgomery. Tom was brought into the project because of his prior experience of working on architecturally and historically significant houses, in particular the Frank Lloyd Wright Millard House, La Miniatura, and John Lautner's Schaefer House, the house you may know from A Single Man. So these are, again, some details. This is now the transition from floor to windows. And you see on the left the floor as it presented itself before work began, and on the right the floor as it looks now. The same pairing looking from the garden into the living room and looking out towards the terrace and the garden and looking towards the meadow. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the GCI for arranging this panel discussion this evening. And I would also like to personally thank Susan, Lucia, and Frank, who all agreed to the idea that we share the work carried out over the past few years in regards to the Eames House Conservation Project. As you have all just heard, we are all familiar with the design of the Eames House and studio, which use prefabricated materials, including a mild steel structure set on a concrete foundation, and a variety of materials that infill the metal frame, including glass, wood, stucco, metal, and synthetic panels. Although built using prefabricated industrial components, you have also seen in Frank's presentation that the house and studio are carefully detailed with craftsman-like attention. Phase 1 works being discussed this evening really encompassed necessary work needed to stabilize the house starting in early 2012. The GCI's role was to undertake investigative and analytic diagnostics work that was needed to perform Phase 1 work. This included investigating specific material issues such as wood paneling of the living room, paint analysis of the exterior metalwork, and to establish the ongoing environmental monitoring program. This evening, I will also present the investigative approaches and how they have helped us gain a better understanding of the materiality of the house and target appropriate conservation solutions for the works which Frank has just described. As Susan mentioned, one of the areas of expertise the GCI can bring to the Eames House is its knowledge in developing appropriate museum environments for important collections and interiors. This draws on current projects in preventive conservation and managing collections in hot, humid, and marine environments. One of the first things the GCI did was to set up an environmental monitoring program. This work was undertaken by GCI senior scientist Shin Mayakawa. An on-site weather station was set up to monitor temperatures and relative humidity, both on the exterior and interior of the house. Monitoring of light, including UV light measurements, is also part of this study. The current environmental monitoring program will lead to the design of a climate management system to protect the interiors. the important collection within the house and its artwork. Developing long-term solutions to manage the Eames House interior and collection is a longer-term GCI project, and I won't be discussing it in detail today, other than setting up the environmental investigations, which are really important to the work regarding the floor replacement. So, as with many thin-skinned modern structures from this era, these buildings are comprised of large expanses of single-glazed windows that provide little thermal insulation. As part of this, environmental issues for the collection interiors and their objects have been debated and discussed continuously by the project team. Over time, exposure of the interior environment at elevated levels of temperature, relative humidity, light, and ultraviolet exposure, and pollutants can induce accelerated aging of the materials, objects, and moreover, the priceless collection of artwork and textiles. This work is still in progress. We are yet to synthesize the results. What was critical to this phase was to determine whether the existing mechanical ducts could be reused as part of the future climate control system, or to replace them once the floor was worked on. The GCI's involvement on the Eames House began after the Eames Foundation and Escher GuneWardena architecture had already started the work. So our work was targeted to the urgent questions which came up with the Eames Foundation. The first of these related to the replacement of the living room floor tiles. The house was built with an in-floor heating system, and in early discussions, Shin determined that these could potentially be reused in a future climate management system for the house. This was one of the only ways to introduce services into the house without major invasive work, or by adding cumbersome services to the interior. Therefore, the first step was really to examine the airflow movement through the house and to confirm if the floor ducts were in place as per the original construction documents. Shin Miyakawa and David Carson, together with EGA, carried out probe investigations to observe and evaluate the condition of the heating ducts, including their potential for reuse. Coupled with video surveys along the interior duct pathways, evidence of localized corrosion was observed. Documentation confirmed that the ductwork could in fact be reused in the future. The duct pathways were recommended to be cleaned by blowing out over a couple decades of dust accumulation. Duct lining material sleeves at slab penetrations were recommended to be repaired to address areas of corrosion. Next was to better understand the moisture levels in the house, and how could this impact the floor repair work. As you heard earlier when Frank discussed the living room floor tile renewal, investigation of the concrete slab was carried out. So a calcium chloride test was conducted to test the moisture vapor transmission through the floor slab. This test works on the principle that calcium chloride salt will absorb moisture from the underlying concrete surface due to its change in weight. 3 tests were carried out across the floor to determine the range of existing moisture conditions. Results ranged from approximately 4 to 5 pounds per square foot, which are not really recommended for long-term adhesion of new floor tiles to the concrete slab. A separate non-obtrusive surface moisture test using 2 4x4 squares of mylar sealed around with tape was also conducted. A data logger was placed underneath the mylar in each location so that relative humidity data could be recorded over the course of a week. This test confirmed the rate of moisture transmission carried out in the prior calcium chloride test. When the test was completed, criteria was established to mitigate the moisture vapor transition through the concrete slab for the new flooring. Some of the criteria that was developed were to reduce the vapor transmission rate to below 2 pounds per square foot, consider installation of a vapor barrier system. This could be no more than an 1/8 inch total added thickness to the concrete slab. Other criteria were that the treatment certainly had to be reversible, and no harmful material chemical off-gassing could occur as a result of the installation of the new vapor barrier system. Essentially, the new vapor barrier detail consisted of a moisture barrier at the base of the system, followed by a primer and skim coat, allowing for a layer of adhesive to the floor tile. As you saw in Frank's presentation, AUDI testing procedures were also carried out on prepared samples here at the GCI. Basically, the laboratory testing emulated this detail. This was done to confirm that there was no chemical off-gassing as a result of the installation of the new barrier system. So each test was carried out over a 28-day period, and really only one system out of the 4 selected passed the off-gassing test, which was frankly quite remarkable. Ironically, this system was the only one to offer a long-term warranty. Of course, other tests to the building envelope were carried out to understand water ingress from the wall and roof areas. However, I only wanted to really discuss the investigative work that directly influenced this phase of work discussed this evening. Another key area where the GCI's expertise was brought to bear, in addition to the floor renewal, was the conservation of the wood paneling and finishes in the living room. The living room wood panel spine wall conservation was carried out with the assistance of Arlen Hagenbothen, Associate Conservator at the J. Paul Getty Museum, together with Hrant Kanjian and Joy Masaryk from GCI Science. In its observed condition, somehow information on the interior wood finish identification and its composition had not really been confirmed over the years. Therefore, a group of 7 samples were collected and investigated to assist in the understanding of the varnish composition and preparation of the treatment plan for a conservation of the wood paneling. Samples were removed about the size of a pencil eraser. The samples were then taken to the Getty Museum for examination. Thin sections were prepared to carry out wood species identification using microscopy. Concurrent with the wood identification, investigation of the wall cavity was also carried out. Here, a panel from the living room was removed to inspect the hidden substrate conditions and to check for possible signs of moisture migration and biodeterioration. While insect damage was not identified under the microscope, localized white fungal hyphae was observed and confirmed along base wood furring strips. As thin sections were prepared and mounted on glass sides, they were also examined in water, then dried, mounted, and re-examined. Analysis and characterization revealed microscopic pits in the cell wall of the wood vessels, which really helped us to identify the wood type as eucalyptus, commonly referred to as Australian tallowwood. As far as we've been able to determine from historical research, the eucalyptus trees which line the Eames House were planted in the late 19th century, possibly as part of a planned development by Abbot Kinney. However, we had no evidence to back our musings that the choice of tallowwood for the living room spine wall was a conscious decision to mirror the eucalyptus outside. Nevertheless, further investigation of former coatings and treatments to the tallowwood wall was carried out. Samples from numerous areas of the walls were taken, characterized, and recorded. Samples from the living room wall finishes showed that presence of cellulose nitrate, ester-containing waxes, metal salts, phthalate plasticizers, calcium oxalate, and alkans were present. Once existing coatings were identified, cleaning samples of the wall were carried out to gently remove dust and dirt particulates, including localized staining where possible. Overall cleaning was accomplished using shell naphtha, which was tested beforehand using soft cotton rags. Some of the existing nitrocellulose varnish remained in place, and so it was decided that we should retain this as part of the patina interlayer of the wall. Conservation of the wall and existing finishes was carried out by applying a very light varnish treatment. It was a combination of Paraloid B72, Laripol A81, and Soluvar. This treatment allowed the original finish to remain intact, while also deciding to retain the rich patina that had developed over time. As we move on with the remaining work for this phase of the project, the exterior paint analysis work, it is important to understand that the main reason for undertaking this analysis was for the painted finishes of the exterior metalwork. as it is known that we had to carry out repainting of the frame and part of the window and door repairs. And so it was decided that an in-depth paint analysis should be carried out to understand how the color along the exterior metalwork had evolved. Findings were compared with archival documentation, physical evidence, and information available in trade catalogs. Based on the laboratory and in situ paint investigations, the color history of the Eames house was researched and explored. While the exterior of the house is currently black, it was discovered that it was originally painted a warm gray, which later evolved into a series of grays and blacks over time. The extant exterior finish color of the steel frame structure is black and is believed to have been so since late 1970, at which time Charles and Ray still resided at the house. Here you can see members of the project team from the paint analysis work: Tom Lerner, head of science; Emily Macdonald Quarth, prior GCI specialist; Ana Arato Consalves, GCI graduate intern from 2012, and myself. As part of the paint analysis work, 15 samples were selectively removed from the house, which you can see here in this diagram. Optical microscopy and chemical analysis to determine stratigraphy and pigment composition was carried out by Alan Phoenix from GCI Science. This work was coupled with on-site paint investigations carried out by Emily Macdonald Quarth. Additionally, samples from 7 painted reference plates and a series of old paint cans were examined and compared as well. The old paint cans and reference plates had dates written on them, so they could be useful. Also, 2 fragments of putty reportedly detached from the 1994 Northridge earthquake were also examined. These samples offered a valuable reference point between 1949 and 2012. Paint samples were prepared as polished cross-sections, examined and photographed using optical microscopy, and analyzed by environmental scanning electron microscope with an attached X-ray energy dispersive system. Selective samples were analyzed for organic binder identification also. And paint excavation exposure windows were also carried out on site, as depicted in the lower row here. So to summarize, what we knew prior to our research was that the 5 painting campaigns were documented in the historic records and serve as reference points for which to compare revealed data. These reference points are depicted in the timeline that you see here. From these records, we know that there was a painting campaign in 2003, the Northridge earthquake in 1994, a painting campaign in 1978, and one in 1989, just after Ray passed away. The dense black color over dark gray were found at the uppermost levels in the exposure windows, which you can see here. This suggests that these 2 uppermost layers derive from principally a recent repainting campaign. Similarly, as we examine the series of blacks, layers 5 through 7, which you see here, we also confirmed that these all have a very similar paint composition. The uppermost layer, layer number 7, which you can see here and here, is tentatively linked to the 1978 repair campaign, and the lower black paint layers 5 and 6 are obviously earlier and are most likely they predate Charles's Eames death. So what this all suggests is that the exterior metalwork of the house was painted black during Charles's lifetime. However, beneath the series of black paints are in fact 2 grays, a very dark gray over a light warm gray, layers 3 and 4. It is extremely likely that this pair of paint layers, very dark gray over a lighter warm gray, represent the first 2 applications of paint to the exterior metalwork. The lower layer, number 3, warm gray, is almost certainly the first coat of paint applied to the exterior metalwork in 1949. Because the two lowest gray paints are made by a unique and painterly method of subtractive color mixing with similar materials in different quantities, it suggests both that the dark gray and warm gray paints were made and also applied during the time of Charles and Ray's time when they were at the house. Warm mineral-based pigments, customly blended and painstakingly mixed to achieve the 1949 grays, was presumably desired by Charles and Ray Eames in the early years of the house. So, as we have seen, continued research not only on the evolution of color at the house, but on the evolution of the setting and the landscape will continue to unfold as additional investigations are carried out. Continued discovery of the evolution of the house, its materiality matched with historic evidence, will allow the story to unfold so that it can be incorporated as part of the conservation management planning to guide the future care and maintenance of the house. Thank you all for listening. And just to give a few credits, we would definitely like to acknowledge the support of the Getty Conservation Institute Council, the Dunard Fund, of course, the Eames Foundation, and all of the project team members of the GCI Field Projects Department, and also the Science Department, and last but not least, our consultants, Escher, GuneWardena Architecture. Thank you.
Great. For me, I think the most just exciting part of all this work has been how it's impacted our decision-making and the way that we've approached ongoing work. So in that context, I'd like to talk about two projects specifically that we've done since this major body of work was done. So the first is the roof. First off, we have new roofs. They've been on since to welcome the new year. And I think that one of the most important things that we learned was just how much information would be impacting our later decisions, as I was saying. So what we found when we were doing steel repair work was that water was flooding over the gravel stop, over the edge of the roof, and it was cascading down all four facades. And it would cascade so strongly that it would actually force its way into cracks and crevices, which was causing erosion. So we knew that we had needed a new roof. We had leaks, and up until that point in time, we had decided we were going to be replacing the roof with an in-kind roof, same materials, same processes. But we found that the risk from ongoing water damage as centuries passed would be so compelling that we needed to consider how we could reconfigure this roof. But we also had to make sure that no visitor could see it. So the new roofs retain the look and approach of the original roof design, and when you look up, you see the original Tuscan steel ferroboard, and when you look down, you see hot mopped asphalt with aggregate on top of it. No new holes were made, which was quite an accomplishment. Thank you, Escher, GuneWardena. But water is corralled and then directed off of the back of the roof via raised lips and then a fully reversible gutter system, which is visible but very discernible. So details will be posted on our website at the end of the summer, so please check back on that. Now, the second project I would like to mention is an ongoing project, and it relates to a color and finishes study that the Getty Foundation graciously funded, thank you, under its Keeping It Modern initiative. And the purpose of the grant is to carry out research in order to understand, obviously, the colors and finishes of the Eames house and studio. And what's great is how all of the work that Kyle was describing really has impacted our approach to the use of color as the Eameses saw it, but also in terms of our decision-making, so that this grant is actually using the work that was done in this early phase as a touchstone for really doing the examination and thinking. We selected Evergreen Architectural Arts, Inc. to carry out this research, and they are identifying the color stratigraphies and finishes, and then ultimately arriving at what potential treatments for cleaning and conserving would would be. And it took over 100 samples, and we cannot wait to see the results. Those will be coming out pretty soon. So I just wanted to really make the point that we talk about the project, phase one, as kind of being finished. But the reality is, if you're going to take care of one of these structures, it is ongoing. And that's, again, not a failure. It's actually a wonderful thing to continue with that approach. Thanks.
Okay, and I'm just going to wrap up by just telling you very quickly what we're up to with the foundation next. And as I mentioned before, one of the things that we started a little while ago is the development of conservation management plan. And so we're right in the thick of working on that right now. And as I said, I mean, that uses a methodology to really bring all the information together, really look at significance and think about how significance could potentially be impacted in the future, and then develop policies to secure the house related to a whole range of things, including kind of visitation, maintenance planning, all of those things that you need to do to secure the house. And I just wanted to acknowledge the work that EJA had done in the development of or undertaking all the fabric analysis of all the various architectural elements of the house. It was undertaken last year and a bit before. Well, I can't remember the years right now, but they're informing the work every day as we're working on that. The work, it's a little bit like a historic structures report, but it's a bit more far-reaching than that and perhaps more holistic. It also looks at a whole range of things, as I said, gets into as far as visitor management and some of those aspects like that. And will help the foundation also be able to do strategic planning and budgeting and all of those things that are needed. We've also just been doing some sort of short studies on things like the landscape, better understanding the trees, their condition. We've recently done an inventory of 240 of the trees on the site, their condition, their anticipated life, all those things that the foundation needs to know to then go on and develop strategies for dealing with the landscape, which is so important to the site. And we've been doing things like geotechnical studies and electrical and services surveys and all those kind of things that you need to do just to understand really what the condition of the house is, to then be able to sort of plan moving forward about what the priorities might be next. The other thing that we're going to be getting back to doing over the next year or so is to really get back and look at the environmental issues, to start now having gathered over a year or two's worth of data on the environment and having the new roof on and the floor done, we can now start to think about what are the ideal environmental conditions, how do we balance that with the way the house needs to be interpreted and presented. And that's based on an understanding of the collection and the fabric in the house and their condition and how they deteriorate and what triggers that deterioration and all those types of things. So that's a project that needs to be developed next. And dealing with the rest of the building envelope is, of course, integral to that. UV light, next phase of works to the steel frame, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a little bit of an update on what is happening next. And as Lucia said, the foundation and the GCI are, of course, really keen to make sure that we're sharing this information as we go along. So there'll probably we haven't really been thinking about what opportunities there are to do things related to that, but we will at some stage, so stay posted. So I think now if we could ask Frank and Kyle to join us, we've got time for some questions. So you've been anxiously, hopefully, keeping your questions and thinking about what else you might like to ask, and we'll endeavour to answer those. So why don't we all take a seat?
Thank you, and thank you so much. I feel silly asking this as the first question, but the eucalyptus, I'm wondering if there was any possibility that, speaking of intent, it would have had a scent when it was first installed, and if that scent would have lasted, and maybe to go even further, if there was any conversation about bringing that back.
Well, does this work? Sorry. I think that's a fascinating question. I really can't answer that question because I haven't found any writings, and it's very easy to make assumptions based on the fact that Charles and Ray were absolutely interested in the scents. And Ray always had a rose of attar. I mean, there was definitely a passion for that. And flowers that were particular favorites often would have scents. And there's a wonderful lyricism to this concept of having this tallowwood wall and then these amazing eucalyptus trees in front that they loved so much. So it does make you wonder. And I'm glad you asked that question because I think I want to delve into that. Thank you.
I wonder if I can add something. I mean, we knew that the wall was essentially a flooring material that the Eameses took and put in a vertical position. But as was mentioned, nobody knew what the wood was. It was not reflected on the plans or in any publications. So I think the fact that it was actually produced as a flooring material, I wonder if it would still have had any sense. And the other thing I think that maybe I believe you mentioned was that the idea was to in a way restore the house to what it was like in 1988, which is the last time that the Eameses lived there. So even if it may have had some wonderful smells before that, under these guidelines, there's no need to restore those.
And while that may be true, I still find that question delightful.
We'll have a symposium about that.
But just to continue on a little bit with that, I think that one of the things that was discovered after the wood was identified, we did understand that flooring material had been used in many different types of vertical and horizontal applications in modern buildings internationally. So one of the reasons that it fell out of favor was because it obviously didn't have much resistance to fire retardation. Anyway, another added tidbit.
The gymnasium floors of my youth.
Yes.
I think there was a question down the front here.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, as conservators, how you decided at what point to stop choosing the color for the steel in terms of whether it was gray or black, and how you make that choice, at which point you make the stop. And then I also just wanted to know if the site is accessible to the public.
Okay, actually, let me answer the second part of it first, which is the site is accessible to the public. We are open Mondays through Saturdays. We are closed Wednesday, let me interject that, from 10 to 4. Reservations are required, and part of the reason is because we want people to be able to experience the site without hordes of people. And the other reason is because there's only a certain amount of visitation that can actually happen on that site without negatively impacting the landscape. It's exterior visits, and then there are very pricey interior tours whose cost goes directly to helping support this work. So we really appreciate when people go for those. And we really want people to visit. So please come by. It's always a very difficult question to consider when you think about what the time of significance is. For me, because of the fact that the house had very few changes from before the time of Charles's death, I actually feel very comfortable just saying 1988, which was when Ray died. Their eye was amazing, and growing up and experiencing, Ray pick the perfect blue, matching it with a perfect red, whatever, I personally feel as though I am not going to change, the final decision. What I am curious about and want to do is one of the things that we're working on for a new website is the ability to take the color studies that Charles and Ray had done before they actually painted their house and then apply it in a computer model so that you can actually see all of these different iterations. And the same thing would be done with the various samples that you had placed up on the wall. We'll probably have to have some sort of a color chart in order so that people can actually true up the colors on their monitor. But I think it would be really interesting. And the Eameses felt that when they first did all of the color studies, they truly believe in this iterative process and working through the possibilities. But also, their intention was, why not repaint the house whenever they felt like it? So the initial expectation was that colors were going to shift. So it never bothered me that it went from a gray over to a black. I just felt that they had made a decision. And quite possibly, they were extraordinarily busy at the time that the black was chosen. It is possible, since their working life was down at 901, they were spending most of their time down there, that they simply knew that a paint job was needed, and they said, please pick a warm black, what's that, and paint the structure. But they were focused on other projects. They had already done that exploration through the color studies, so maybe they moved on.
I think that's quite interesting, because that's always been one of the questions, because clearly there was this very strong intent for those early colours. It's talked about in articles. Yep. It clearly was very painterly. It was a mixed paint. As you move through time, they become standard off-the-shelf paint colours. And so that question of who did make that decision, was it a conscious choice? Was it, we just need to repaint the house? And so I think that's quite interesting. And I think the other thing that's important, and when it might come to repainting, the whole house, because the exterior is having a much more comprehensive repair work that's undertaken, and it has to be related to the interior. The patterns of painting are not, if I remember correctly, and Carl, somebody else might need to correct me, I don't think they were completely in tandem. They weren't, the exterior wasn't painted at the same time as the interior. There weren't the same number of repaintings. And so when the colour study comes back too, you might find that there are different campaigns that relate to the exterior and the interior. And so that's why I personally, Lucia just talked about a period of significance. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that idea, because things happen at different times around a building, and I think things evolve, and sometimes things that are related to the earliest period of a building and relate to a later period of building can also be of equal significance, but they were just happening at different times. So I kind of I think it's once we start to put all those information together, there's going to be some really interesting decisions that have to be made, because you want to be consistent with your decisions for the interior and the exterior and the studio and the house, and they're not all the same. So it's quite complicated, actually. But the point, I think, is, and one of the things that it's been so amazing working with an organisation like the Eames Foundation, is that there's a lot of information. There's a lot of first-hand stories. There's stories that sometimes we find through research aren't quite what you thought. But it's a matter of putting all the information together in a way so you can understand the story as far as you can, based on the information that you have, and then deciding what's important and why, and then make conservation decisions that are consistent and relate to that same piece of information and are made using that same information in the same way, if that makes sense. So one of the things that the Foundation has been so interested in is thinking about the long-term conservation of the house, is starting with a very firm understanding of those things, so that decisions are made now, are well understood as to why they were made and what information they were based on. And so when people are making decisions in the future, they can really understand how that has happened. I think it's not that usual that you have a steward of a building who really is that into that idea, which we as conservators obsess about.
Well, we are obsessed with it too. We want that roadmap. We want to make sure that those decisions made when all of us are not here really remain true to the intent that the Eames has had. Like we said, we aren't interested in fetishizing the site. It really is about capturing that intent. And that's why really figuring out, there aren't really any easy answers. There's a lot of thought that goes into every single decision. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question up the back there, I think.
Yes, could someone talk more about the landscape, about the meadow? I seem to remember Ray once saying that they decided to try never to put a lawnmower there, that it would be scythed, the grass would be scythed. And what about the walk? Do I recall that those are railroad ties?
The walk definitely, again, I'm going backwards, but nonetheless, the walk definitely was railroad ties. Unfortunately, because of creosote and all these other elements, it's very difficult to get what I would consider, equivalent railroad ties today. So we instead have blocks that are about 4 inches square, which unfortunately also don't last as long. When you see the early photos, you do see that wonderful just expanse without the railroad ties. You see gravel, and then you do see the layering of textures and elements as the years go by. It was a home. It's probably the same approach most of us use. It's, you start putting things back into place. The things that I love about the meadow is that Charles and Ray did want it to reflect nature, the natural environment of California. Having said that, they picked a particular ryegrass that had a certain green and a certain leaf shape that is anything but native. And so the idea was that they let weeds grow in it, and there'd be daffodils and maybe narcissus, in different spots, but that it would have that character of a natural, element. And it's something that we have to maintain constantly, but we also have to be very respectful about, and thank God, about the fact that they did not want it to be green in the heat of the summer, let it lie fallow. Mm-hmm. And so that will probably save us in 200 years or whenever, when, water is rationed severely. Mm-hmm. Not sure I really answered your question.
Well, maybe just to add something that sort of ties into the eucalyptus wall. I mean, the connection between architecture and landscape is a central idea of modernism, of course. And to me, it was something of an enormous surprise, and things that you knew and the family knew. But there's, for example, on the wall facing the terrace, there is a small panel that first I thought was a cement panel with stains. And then I was told that no, it's actually a photograph of the site. And what this tells us is sort of the idea that the site is echoed in the building. That's why I also believe that the choice of eucalyptus was not a coincidence. I really think that this was very deliberately done to sort of have a machined sort of echo of the trees that are there, and I mean, the house is very precisely set between this row of trees at the toe of the hill.
Well, Ray did say it at a certain point, that for her, at some point, the structure itself ceased to be seen.
Right.
The goal really was to be part of that nature, and it's something that's very difficult for any steward of any landscape to deal with, because you look at some of the elements in the site. You look at the fact that a particular pine has basically tripled its size and is no longer in scale. A persimmon tree that we fortunately were able to graft before it actually, really went kaput. We've been able to grow, and we will be replanting it soon. And the significance of that tree was that it was a gift from Eero Saarinen to them when they moved into the house. So by its nature, landscapes shift and flow. You look at neighborhood encroachment, and you'll see that we've let a wall of honeysuckle and plumbago grow about 16 or 18 feet tall, with a specific goal of blocking our neighbors. Because when it comes back to the grounds, the fundamental intent of that landscape, that's what we really want to curate and present. We want people to get that sense of, oh, down there's a little vista, and you see this, and you see the ocean at the end of it. And there's a sense of expansiveness and a sense of you are in nature and you are not seeing your neighbors. To your point, when they originally built the house, they excavated a good chunk of the hill that they, of course, then nestled the house into. And then they used that dirt to create a berm between their house and the Intenza house, so that when you were inside the structures, you wouldn't see each other. So that siting was very careful, not only in terms of the house with, on its property, but also the house with the other case study program houses that are on that bluff. There are 5, by the way.
And I mean, if you remember how the living room is laid out, there is this sort of alcove, this sort of small protected corner, and you have this sort of diagonal view through the living room, and above this view is where there is a solid piece of wall, which actually forces you to look at the meadow rather than looking up at the sky. And I think things like that were very, very precisely framed, and views were very precisely laid out.
And to just carry that further, the way that the actual built-in seating is actually twisted just slightly so that you do get that view.
Right, yeah.
Okay, we have this one here, and then this one over here.
Thank you. This is a more personal rather than technical question for Ms. Atwood, but I'm assuming that there was a point in your childhood where you were not aware of the historical or architectural significance of the house. And I'm wondering when that transition occurred and how your early relationship, the emotional relationship you had with the house, affects what you do now with the house.
Well, I love that house. And I love it for a lot of different reasons. Because for me, when I went to the house, the first time I was there, I was age 2. I honestly do not remember much of my visit there. But what I do remember is something that was so shocking to me as a child, was that my brother and sister were swinging on a rope, crashing into this huge pile of boxes in the studio. And they were climbing up on the stairs and swinging out, and like, who does that? Really. And that sense of joy and fun and using the space to really engage the visitor, no matter if they're 2 or 85 or whatever, was always my experience when I went there. I mean, Charles, one time I was there by myself, and I was probably around 12 or 11, I don't remember, but we were shooting Polaroid shots out in the meadow. And it was this wonderful process of talking with Charles. I would show him my shot, and he would admire something about it. And he would never say it was really good or bad, and you should do this and you should do that. Instead, he would comment on mine, show me his, and what I later realized was that he was just letting me teach myself, essentially. So it's those really deep connections with those people that were my early love of the house. And then probably sometime when I was taking a year off from college and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do, and I spent a summer at the office of Charles and Ray before, Charles and Ray were still there, and we were working on Franklin and Jefferson exhibit. I was a gopher, by the way, but a fabulous job because I was taking Ray around. Part of my job was to help arrange flowers or help at a party serving strawberries. So I saw the house not only through the way I had as a child, but through their eyes in terms of how they appreciated various elements of a structure, or made a little bouquet out of a clover and a grass and a weed, but it was exquisite. And then I started seeing how visitors reacted to the site. And then you just start reading and looking and thinking more about things. And so I guess it's something that I go there, and other people have said the same thing. Every time I see something new. And so for me, it's always fresh and exciting. Never gets old.
And I think one of the things that's challenging right now, and we're in the middle of trying to work some of these things out, is capturing those parts of significance that you were just talking about, which are special about this house. I mean, it's a superb piece of architecture. There's lots of reasons why it's significant. We could kind of, lost my microphone. We could rattle them off, but there's still very strong intangible values at that house, which go from those things that you were just talking about, the way the family enjoyed the house, the way Ray enjoyed welcoming people to the house, the sort of things that she did to do that. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges in terms of capturing what's important about the house and how do you ensure you sustain that part of its significance through into the future that we're not so good at in conservation practice. We can get to the physical stuff and we can work out how to do these and that, but that's one of the challenges I think that's going to be really interesting. And it's sort of what makes dealing with the conservation of modern architecture actually really interesting when you've still got that tangible link to activities, things that just happened there that are not grand stories or particular events, but day-to-day practices or things that people did that were part of, that also in Ray and Charles's case sort of explain their design, ethos and processes and all of those different things.
It really is the toughest thing that I'm trying to deal with right now. And one of the things that we're doing at the foundation is for a while we were doing flowers kind of what I would call as a uniform. And we did it because there were, for a lot of different reasons, but the time came where we felt that it was important to start acknowledging deeply the fact that the flowers in the landscape needed to have that sense of just suitability, of matching, so that you had the sense that flowers were being taken from the garden and put in the vases in the house. It's a subtlety, but again, it's bringing in that landscape into the house and really unifying it. And so, somewhat inconsistently, we take photos of the vases, both the ones that work, that don't work. We do research in terms of looking at photographs of vases that were done by the Eameses. And, it's interesting. For me, I just go and I do it, and then sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And then I try to do it again and again. Sometimes it works or it doesn't. So it's kind of a process of backing in, but I comfort myself by reminding myself that the time they took those photos were the time when they really had, wow, this was magical. These were the ones they wanted to remember and to capture. They don't have thousands of photos of those particular vases. But it's tough, it's hard. For me, it's the most important thing that I think I need to do, because the aesthetic is such an important part of that space. It's more than just you put this here and that here and that here. You would watch Charles and Ray at home adjusting things subtly during the day like we all do. And I need to just make a comment that I sometimes say Ray without mentioning Charles, and that actually isn't intended to exclude Charles, who was always very passionately concerned about the look of the place and the experience of living in it. He, in fact, found the living room rugs and delighted in sending them back to the house. And yes, they were perfect. But I usually say Ray because I was working in LA for the years after Charles had died. So it was that connection. It should not be construed to exclude Charles's interest.
Okay, we're just going to, there was one question up here before. Has that disappeared, that up there? No? Okay. I think this might be the last one because we're short on time. No, sorry.
I was wondering if you thought that, or know, if the Eameses as artists had a awareness or concern about how the house would eventually deteriorate, or did they feel that it would stand the test of time and stand the elements, or maybe it just would be, what would be would be?
Well, I can certainly say that Ray was concerned about the house and about its being cared for and presented in what I would call an authentic way, which to me implies that, as things deteriorated, deteriorate, they are taken care of. They had incredible eyes, you're absolutely right. But they themselves evolved things as time went on. When you look at the panels of the eucalyptus, with the eucalyptus image on the exterior of the house, there were at least 4 panels that our archivist David Hertzgaard found. And they all were viewed as being, appropriate. If they weren't, they would not have been mounted. That's something we know. But I think people pretty much muddle through when it's their house. I mean, they do repairs, they fix things. You don't like the color on a certain wall, you paint it. And given that Charles and Ray were so very present in what they were doing now, they weren't really looking back to recreate things. They wanted the house to reflect who they were now, I suspect. I think other people, particularly in our family, and those people who really, were close friends and colleagues, would probably be able to add a lot more to that. I hope some people here will.
Okay. All right. I think we're out of time. So first, I'd just like to thank our speakers. I really can't do this thing tonight. I'm just going to hold it. I just would like to thank our speakers, Lucia Dewey Atwood, and all the people at the Eames Foundation that we've had the privilege to work with, Eames and Shelley and Catherine and David Hertzgaard. And there's just a long list of people that we've had an incredible experience and pleasure to work with. I'd like to thank Frank and Ravi and Boya and Julia, the people at EGA, who we've had a really interesting time and learnt a lot working with you all as well. I want to say special thanks to Kyle for coming back and talking about his work when he was at the Getty. We miss you, and Kyle worked incredibly hard on this project. And I'd just like to acknowledge all our wonderful scientists who worked on this project, and Alan from our museum. As well. And I just want to thank Gail Ostergren and Sarah Powers as well, who are part of the Field Projects team who helped organise this evening. And there are a lot of other people who have been mentioned here this evening that I'm sure we all think are really important. And I or some of us may not have mentioned everyone, but you know who you are, and so thank you. And thank you to the audience. Thanks for coming along tonight. It's been great to be able to talk about such an important place here in Los Angeles. And as I said, it's been a great honour for us at the GCI to play some sort of role in the conservation of this wonderful place. Thank you all.